Hey there, everyone. Today we're going to continue our Being in Time for Beginners series. This lecture series accompanies a reading group we're doing right now, which you can either join in on if you're watching this at the time that these are coming out, or even, afterwards, you can just follow along with the reading schedule as is. This time we're moving past the introduction into Division 1, and we're going to be talking about the first chapter, which is Heidegger's preparatory analysis of Dasein. Just to recap the reading schedule real quick, here it is. Again, if you're following along at the time, then you can follow these dates. But even if not, and you just want to read Being in Time, try this reading schedule. See if it works for you. It's meant to kind of, you're doing max 20 pages aside from the introduction, which is just, you just got to hammer through that. But see description for all the details regarding edition and whatnot. And I've talked about that in the previous lecture in this series. So this chapter is basically an overview of Dasein. We've been told a little bit about what Dasein is in the introduction, but it was very cursory, and this time he's going to make it a more explicit part of the project. We've figured out that if we want to understand being, Dasein is our sort of chosen way in, because Dasein's own being is constantly in question. Thus, it is constantly comported towards its own being. So we'll kind of talk more about this, but he opens up this section 9. The being whose analysis our task is always we ourselves. And in the endnote, he clarifies we would also be I ourselves. And that's kind of important. The being of this being is always mine. So, right, that's why he said I, because it being mine means that you can always use the personal pronoun to denotate Dasein. In the being of this being, it is related to its being. That's the definition of Dasein right there. In the being of this being, meaning the way that it be in the world, so to speak. And sometimes you can use that when you're reading Heidegger. You can use kind of crude English like that, and it actually helps make sense of things. But in its mode of being, it is related to its own being. That's one of its kind of defining qualities. That's what differentiates it from something which is ready to hand or something which is present at hand. You'll also hear like occurrentness as other terms for this, objective presence. We'll talk about all these terms as we go on, so don't feel alarmed. I'm just trying to kind of give you a wider scope. As the being of this being, it is entrusted to its own being. It is being about which this being is concerned. So, right, we are oriented towards our own being in the existential mode of concern, and we have concern towards our own existence. So this is a nice four-part little table kind of summarizing this chapter from the Blattner guide, which, I'll continue to use in this because it's quite helpful. And if this is, of course, using the terminology from the McCory and Robinson translation, so it's a little different than ours, but maybe the alternate translation might help. So first, Dasein's being is mine. It's something which is my ownness. Dasein comports itself towards its being. And nothing else but Dasein in Heidegger's system does that. It comports itself towards its own being, which is to say it has an attitude towards it. It orients itself towards its own being and makes it a question. And then, Dasein is delivered over to its being. And this is kind of, a lot of things are delivered over to their being, right? They embody life as the mode of being, which they are. And then being is at issue for Dasein. And that fourth point is one of the more existentialist points of this work, is that, our questions of existence and whatnot, they are an issue for us. We're constantly trying to resolve and solve to an extent. And one of Heidegger's kind of existentialist concerns here, although he didn't like that label, is to try to figure out how that continuous unfolding of being and the truth of being, how that all happens while realizing that it itself is an interminable process. So let's go into Dasein in some more detail. I think a big aspect of Dasein, which is really hinting at how Heidegger is departing from Descartes or Husserl, is our mode of comportment or action towards our being in our daily life. He says the essence of this being lies in its to be. That's zu sein in the German. The whatness, essentia, of this being must be understood in terms of its being, existentia, insofar as one can speak of it at all. And this is, again, one of those instances of crude English where we can summarize this by saying Dasein is defined by the way it be. And not only that, but the way it comports itself towards other beings. It's grounded in the way it orients itself towards its world and thereby makes an issue out of not only the world, but its own being. That's one of the important points, is that in Dasein's comportment towards the world, it is actively revealing something about its being, and thereby being itself. The reason for Heidegger's phenomenological method is we're slowly revealing something about the structure of being by actually living. And Blattner says zu sein is a gerundative. Just as Dasein may have things to do, it has being to be. Put more colloquially then, Heidegger is saying that I am a life to live. He wants to refocus our understanding of what it is to be a person away from reflection and self-consciousness and towards how we live our lives. So we're departing from the sort of rationalist approach of the likes of Descartes or Kant, where we're sort of this detached, rational agent that makes a representation of the world in our head. Instead, Heidegger is showing that most of the time, the way we be is our action, right? And our action is this unreflective process of, I open a door when I need to get into a room, and I don't even think about opening the door. It's just a means to an end that my body does automatically because I've gone through the process so many times. And this gets to a point that Sartre is going to take when he writes Being and Nothingness, which is itself kind of a riff on being and time. The essence of Dasein lies in its existence. The characteristics to be found in this being are thus not present attributes of an objectively present being, which has such and such an outward appearance, but rather possible ways for it to be, and only this. And that's important, because basically what Heidegger is saying there is that Dasein is not just another object. This objective presence that he's talking about, this is Vorhandenheit in the German. It's translated in the McCory and Robinson translation as readiness to hand. And, you could think of this as just your average object that is just something that you use as a tool. But, we don't tend to comport ourselves towards other Daseins as if they were tools. We treat them a little bit differently. We treat them with much more ethical significance, for one, but also just the way we interact with other Daseins is very different, because we can talk with each other. We can do all sorts of complex things. So the point here is that the essence of what makes Dasein what it is, and this is significant, is in terms of existence in the way he's using it here, the existence with the Z here, that only applies to Dasein. And he's not saying that nothing else is. That's not what he's saying. Of course, Heidegger has said already, if we can think about it, it exists in some way. It's just a matter of figuring out how it exists and in what relation it is to other existent entities. But this quality of existence is specific to Dasein, because what he's meaning here is in the same sense when you ask, like, what is the meaning of my existence? It's the sort of method of comportment towards the world that you can only get as Dasein. You can't get it as other entities. This is once again another of the existentialist-ish themes, which is the idea of possibility for being. Heidegger writes, the being which is concerned in its being about its being, that's Dasein right there, again we get that definition, is related to its being as its own most possibility. So, right, own most, again, this is something which is mine. This is, right, every existence is one person's own unique existence. No one else can live my life for me. Dasein is always its possibility. It does not have that possibility only as a mere attribute of something objectively present. Again, that's Vorhandenheit, for objectively present. And because Dasein is always essentially its possibility, it can choose itself in its being. It can win itself, it can lose itself, or it can never and only apparently win itself. It can only have lost itself, and it can only have not yet gained itself because it is essentially possible as authentic. That is, it belongs to itself. So, right, there's a sense of individuality that comes with one's own being that is a sort of unfolding personal project. And it requires, probing into your existence and figuring out this, for example, the Seinsfrage. What is being? What do we mean by it? I mean, we use it, but Heidegger's pretty sure we never actually knew what we were talking about when we used that term. And this possibility for being that is essentially our existence unfolding, it's not something that we have, like, it's not some material object you can find somewhere. It's some horizon for being is the word he uses. So not only does Dasein comport itself towards the world, but it acts within that world by acting on certain possibilities for action. Wagner says to be a person is to project a person to be, and so our being is at issue. So, right, being matters to Dasein. It's not just trivial. It's not just, oh, I exist. It's like all the time, oh, what is the meaning of existence? Blah, 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 blah. Here, the picture of ask questions about your work. Pretty sure people doubt themselves at work all the time. What am I working for? Blah, blah, blah. This is the kind of stuff that is how Dasein orients itself towards its world. And it has the possibility to authentically look at the way that it comports itself towards the world and face the world as it is, or it can kind of shy away and be inauthentic. And it's important to note here that he doesn't use inauthentic in a pejorative sense necessarily. It is a properly ontological, or rather it's an existential denotation here of the way in which we approach those structures which govern our being. Things like being and time, right? These are the structures that Dasein is within, and that Heidegger's been talking about this whole time. So when he talks about inauthenticity, it's not like in the sense that we talk about it today as like, oh, I'm just not being my authentic self. I just need to come out and figure out what I've always truly been this whole time. Because, of course, for Heidegger, it's not really a point like that. In fact, Dasein's being, Dasein is always its possibility, is essentially always forward-facing, always continuing to unfold itself. So authentically being your own Dasein does not mean like finding yourself again here as something objectively present that was there the whole time. No, it's something you have to make. So you can see the links here between Heidegger and the sort of work mentality of like the blacksmith that he's so interested in, the person who uses the hammer, the artisan, the craftsman. They actively make being a question that they can kind of grab by the neck, so to speak, and they can make it an issue which they unfold on their terms. Now, everydayness is something we've talked about in the introduction, but he continues, this indifference of the everydayness of Dasein is not nothing, but rather a positive phenomenal characteristic. All existing is how it is out of this kind of being and back into it. We call this everyday indifference to Dasein averageness or Durchschnittlichkeit. In it too, and even in the mode of inauthenticity, the structure of existentiality lies a priori. In it too, Dasein is concerned in a particular way about its being to which it is related in the mode of average everydayness, if only in the mode of fleeing from it or in the mode of forgetting it. Right? So the true nature of Dasein's being, right? This is its existentiality. It is always positively present as a mode of being, as a way in which Dasein comports itself towards the world. So even if, for example, you want to be a recluse and you want to go basically, I don't know, deny the proclivity towards social life that is modern existence, if you want to like forget all the people and just go live on your own, even that is a mode of existing. It's just you're pretending like you're negating that social existence, but actually you're affirming it because it has to be there in the first place to be negated, to be a recluse from, right? So this is this sort of authenticity versus inauthenticity. Do you accept the thrownness, Geworfenheit, of your being? Are you ready to face it on its own terms and realize that you're not the one who sets those terms? And therefore, even when we live out our everyday life in Durchschnittlichkeit, in our average everydayness, that's not nothing. That is, in fact, a positive way in which we live our lives most of the time. Once again, walking through doors and opening them without having to think about it, going downstairs without having to think about it, opening your phone and checking stuff, just almost like a reflex nowadays. This is all the stuff that defines Dasein's everydayness. And there is a difference within this everydayness that can be made between authentic and inauthentic. Now, this is one of the more technical points, and I've given in this red box some pretty like chunky definitions. I could have made them less chunky, but it would mean losing the specificity, and I wanted it to make itself very clear such that you could refer back to it if you need to. But basically, Heidegger is speaking here of two types of beings. We've got beings who are a who existence. This would be Dasein. And you've got everything else. A what? Objective presence in the broader sense. So, a Dasein is a who. It has a personality because it orients itself towards its being. And then what's is everything that is Vorhandenheit, that is objectively present. And in order to discuss these different beings, we have to refer to certain aspects or characteristics of these beings, something that denotates them as being determined as unique beings. If I talk about my phone, I have to talk about different properties it has, different aspects that make it what it is. These can be very varying, but he says existentials and categories are the two fundamental possibilities of the characteristics of being. So we've basically got two different ways. These are terms for the terms we use to talk about different kinds of beings. So for Daseins, for these types of beings, the aspects of that being, i.e. its structure of existence, the being Sein, is an existential. So this is the sort of stuff that is the structure of Dasein's existence. This is the stuff we're talking about when we talk about existentials. So, Heidegger in Division 2, he will connect this with time, for example, and talk about how time and memory and stuff like that alters the way that we exist and kind of structures our existence. And then categories are aspects of the being of beings which are objectively present. Vorhandenheit, once again. So this would be like your phone or your hammer is the common example here. Now Heidegger's already done this a bit in the introduction, but he criticizes ontologies that begin with a rational, a self-contained, detached subject who forms mental representations of the world. And of course, along with this is the problem of how do I know that everything outside of my mind is true? And Heidegger is very critical of this inside the mind versus outside of the mind because, like he said in the introduction, it's essentially an abstraction that comes from bringing philosophical assumptions into a being that actually isn't governed by those assumptions most of the time. And in fact, the being of this being, which is Dasein, is way more exciting than that. It's much less rational in a sense. It's more streamlined and integrated into the world, partly because we are in der Welt sein, being in the world. He writes, historiographically, the intention of the existential analytic, right? So making an analysis of existence in the sense of Dasein, right? Because only Dasein has existence in this sense. Historiographically, the intention of the existential analytic can be clarified by considering Descartes, to whom one attributes the discovery of the cogito sum, that is the I think, therefore I am, right, as the point of departure for all modern philosophical questioning. He investigates the cogitare of the ego within certain limits, but the sum, that is the I am, he leaves completely undiscussed, even though it is just as primordial as the cogito. Our analytic raises the ontological question of the being of the sum, of the I am. Only when the sum is defined does the manner of the cogitationes become comprehensible. So, Descartes is trying to figure out, well, what is the cogito, the thinking thing? That's what cogito says the self is I am defined by thinking, because he goes down his philosophy of doubt, and he's thinking about thinking and doubting, and, well, he has to be thinking to do all this. So no matter what he can doubt, he knows that he is thinking, and that is what defines his being. But he completely ignores being. So he starts trying to give attributes to being, predicates to being, without actually answering what the heck being is. And you can see pretty clearly that this is a long and hard project, considering that Heidegger is saying basically no one has ever actually talked about it. He continues by saying every idea of a subject, unless refined by a previous ontological determination of its basic character, still posits the subjectum ontologically along with it, no matter how energetic one's ontic protestations against the substantial soul or the reification of consciousness. Thingliness itself needs to be demonstrated in terms of its ontological source in order that we can ask what is now to be understood positively by the non-reified being of the subject, the soul, consciousness, the spirit, the person. All these terms name definite areas of phenomena which can be developed, but they're never used without a remarkable failure to see the need for inquiring about the being of the beings so designated. So, right, Descartes is basically saying that the substance of the self is that it is a thinking thing. That somehow defines its unique substantiality, which he finds in the soul and things like this. But, the idea of the subject in the Cartesian sense, or the soul, or any of this stuff, all of this is the thingliness he's speaking of here. And all of this needs to be demonstrated ontologically as actually being something distinct, and more so, giving it a positive character. Because what Heidegger realizes is that when Descartes talks about ontology, really he's talking about epistemology, and he's creating all these false barriers about, when I exist in the world, I'm just completely detached from everything, and I make a representation in my head, and, I could doubt everything. And it's like, that's kind of, Descartes had to lock himself in his room so that he could actually write the meditations, because if he got out into the world, he'd realize that so much of his assumptions are not true. So that idea of the subject doesn't actually positively understand being in any way. It sets up a bunch of barriers, and then it actually doesn't answer or even regard the Seinsfrage in any way. So that is Heidegger's criticism here, is that we haven't actually even oriented ourselves towards the Seinsfrage. We haven't figured out how to kind of make our way in. What is our being we should use for our preparatory analysis, which here is Dasein. Now, in the last part of the chapter, he's talking about the unique ability for philosophy to answer this kind of question, and how it can't be done by anthropology or psychology or biology. He maintains that none of these can adequately approach Dasein in relation to the Seinsfrage, so with regards to its existentials. Now, it can tell us all sorts of ontic things about the different beings that are Daseins, but it can't tell us about the being, the Sein of Dasein. right? Because Dasein, if you split it up crudely, and Heidegger actually does this in an endnote at one point, it is being, das Da, the there. So there's a sort of locatedness within being, and we are being in that location. So it's almost like we're in this nested question of figuring out how to talk about the Seinsfrage. And Heidegger says, look, like anthropology, it's not going to give us what we need. These approaches will only ever give us categorical, that's to say, relating to these categories that we denoted. It only gives us categorical understandings of existence, not an existential one. So Heidegger here lays out two common anthropological definitions of Dasein. And it's important to note that in these endnotes, which you get, by the way, in the Revised Stambau translation, these are, they'll have like little stars or little like crosses. These are actually Heidegger's subsequent notes from after Being in Time was published, and he's basically gone back and annotated certain stuff and been like, no, or like add a clarifying word. And he adds, they did not aim at Dasein at all. So they've talked about Dasein, but they haven't actually understood Dasein as a mode of being, as something unique in its approach towards being itself. So there's two, approaches here. You've got the rational animal approach, and then you've got created in the image of God. And to give you a gloss, it's not like super, super important with regards to kind of the greater project here, but just some of this stuff can get kind of confusing, and there's a lot of diversions that he's making, all very systematic and, defined and delineated. But in terms of the rational animal approach, this would be Aristotle. It uses the logos as a sort of filler concept to defer actually answering the Seinsfrage. So, right, the logos, we've talked a little bit about this before. It has some property of denoting things within a discourse, of almost pointing towards them per se, and of sort of making them explicit in their being. So, for example, the rational animal, there's some special access towards the logos that kind of does a lot of the heavy lifting, as Heidegger sees it. And we don't actually answer the Seinsfrage because we just talk about various different beings, and then we invent some rationality, which makes us completely different than all the other beings. But that's only ontically, which is to say with reference to beings of various kinds. Ontologically, we haven't actually approached Dasein, once again, or the Seinsfrage. We haven't approached these structures of Dasein's being. We've just talked about these particulars of its material being, which is only part of the equation. And then he's equally reticent to accept the idea of created in the image of God. This is the theological definition that he sees. And for this one, it answers the Seinsfrage, or rather attempts to, by deferring our ontology just a step back to God. Right? We are created in the image of God, and that begs the question, well, what is the image of God? What is the ontology of God? And once again, this is doing a lot of heavy lifting. It's very easy to say, I am made in the image of God. You're made in the image of God. But what is the image of God? People still argue about this. And of course, considering Heidegger's, what he's said about ontotheology so far, we know that this is a dead end. If we just see being as being resolved or explained by more beings, we just get an infinite regress. And then also, this created in the image of God, it interpolates non-words effectively, such as man is rational, man is intelligent, man is prudent, man is virtuous. All of this stuff is kind of, it's just our own human biases trying to give a definition to ourselves, whereas they don't actually really mean anything. I mean, read some Foucault to see why they don't really mean what we think they are. They're a sort of kind of internal creation of what we would like ourselves to be. And now we get to the point where we're starting to see how this is going to go into the next chapter. So this existential analytic of Dasein, we have to do this with orientation towards Dasein's everydayness, how it usually orients itself towards the world. And that calls into question, what is the world, for example? And he writes, in suggesting that anthropology, psychology, and biology all fail to give an unequivocal and ontologically adequate answer to the question of the kind of being of this being that we ourselves are, no judgment is being made about the positive work of these disciplines. But on the other hand, we must continually be conscious of the fact that these ontological foundations can never be disclosed subsequently from empirical material by the use of hypotheses. Rather, they are always already there, even when the empirical material is only collected. So, right, that's important. This understanding of being is already there, that he's essentially going against empiricism here in its strictest sense of we figure out everything about being from empirical experience. And he's like, well, no, we don't even have to formally learn it necessarily or gain it explicitly from experience. It's just sort of this background that seeps into us that we slowly understand. He continues, the syncretistic comparison and classification of everything does not of itself give us genuine essential knowledge. Subjecting the manifold to tabulation does not guarantee a real understanding of what has been ordered. The genuine principle of order has its own content which is never found by ordering, but is rather already presupposed in ordering. Thus, the explicit idea of world as such is a prerequisite for the order of world images. And just to decipher this, all of these beings, when we're trying to understand them, when we do it ontically, which is to say with reference towards beings instead of with reference to Sein, to being, when we do that, we're sort of trying to classify them, right, all on this plane of beings without ever actually figuring out what we mean by being, by Sein. And thus, we are not going to figure out the ordering principle, which is being, right? That which determines beings as beings that we've talked about before, that denotes something as a unique individual being of its own, with its own properties or isness, right? Hexeity, to use Duns Scotus's term. You're not going to be able to look at different ordered entities and find the ordering principle if you're just doing it in an empirical manner like anthropology or psychology or biology. You have to look into the existence of Dasein, which is essentially comported towards its own existence, its own being. And thereby, we can try to figure out what those presuppositions are and figure out what being is. So that concludes our coverage of this first chapter of Division 1. I hope the reading is going okay so far if you've been reading it. It's a very interesting read and probably pretty dense, so just go slow, annotate, summarize stuff as you read it on the page, do whatever you have to do. Check out any of my other lectures in this series or other ones on postmodernism, German idealism, gender theory, post-colonial studies, other literature. You can become a channel member for $5 a month and gain access to, among other things, a monthly private philosophy Zoom. Also have super thanks if you're just wanting to donate to the channel because books are not cheap. That's it for this lecture, and I'll see you in another one.